All right, let's do a quick little overview of my plane. It is a Skyshadow S800, and my flight controller is a Matek F405 wing. I'm running it on a 4-cell 2200 milliamp pack. I have a T motor 2207 1850 kV motor. My camera is the Flite Nano HD, where it records HD footage also. I 3D printed these vortex generators. I have a little GPS here, a couple of Emax digital servos. Now here's where mine may be a little bit different. I have a Spektrum receiver and I have a EZUHF Nano receiver. This was going to be my long-range wing, but I found that I rarely fly it more than a mile out, and I can get that stuff with the Spektrum. So when I need to go really, really far, I just unplug the receiver underneath from the Spektrum, and then I plug it in the EZUHF Nano and adjust some settings in inav. My video transmitter is the Tramp HV. It's been flawless for me, and it's running inav 2.6.
Satellites, heading 7, range 0, bearing 308, elevation 3, 0 minute, sensors OK. Heading 349, range 3, bearing 335, elevation 19, voltage 14.5, 9 satellites. 8 satellites. Heading 182, range 209, bearing 248, starting mission, elevation 131, voltage 15.1, 10 satellites. 9 satellites. Heading 23, range 574, bearing 282, elevation 68, voltage 14.9, 10 satellites. 9 satellites. Heading 187, range 160, bearing 237, elevation 101, voltage 14.9, 10 satellites, 1 minute, 9 satellites. Heading 6, range 580, bearing 280, elevation 55, voltage 14.7, 10 satellites, 9 satellites. 10 satellites. Heading 164, range 177, bearing 266, elevation 95, voltage 14.8, 11 satellites, 12 satellites. 14 satellites, heading 343, range 511, bearing 262, elevation 91, voltage 14.7, 12 satellites. 13 satellites. Heading 162, range 209, bearing 289, elevation 98, voltage 14.7, 14 satellites, 12 satellites, 2 minutes. 14 satellites. Heading 333, range 488, bearing 256, elevation 108, voltage 14.7, 11 satellites. 15 satellites. Heading 156, range 196, bearing 297, elevation 91, voltage 14.6, 14 satellites, 16 satellites. 15 satellites, heading 326, range 485, bearing 256, elevation 124, voltage 14.6, 15 satellites. 16 satellites, heading 205, range 108, bearing 260, elevation 95, voltage 14.5, 17 satellites, 16 satellites. 17 satellites, heading 348, range 547, bearing 268, elevation 111, voltage 14.5, 3 minutes, 13 satellites. 16 satellites, heading 221, range 170, bearing 224, elevation 104, voltage 14.4. 16 17 satellites, heading 63, range 583, bearing 300, elevation 75, voltage 14.3, 16 satellites. 15 satellites. Heading 272, range 406, bearing 219, elevation 101, voltage 14.4, 17 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 150, range 459, bearing 310, elevation 104, voltage 14.3, 17 satellites, 4 minutes. 16 satellites. Heading 357, range 462, bearing 223, elevation 114, voltage 14.3, 16 satellites. 17 satellites. Heading 130, range 334, bearing 300, elevation 111, voltage 14.3, 17 satellites. 16 satellites, heading 318, range 393, bearing 240, elevation 131, voltage 14.3, 17 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 148, range 193, bearing 297, elevation 95, voltage 14.2, 18 satellites. 5 minutes. 17 satellites, heading 329, range 436, bearing 254, elevation 124, voltage 14.3, 15 satellites. 18 satellites. Heading 245, range 124, bearing 219, elevation 111, voltage 14.3, 16 satellites, 15 satellites. 13 satellites. Heading 34, range 452, bearing 303, elevation 118, voltage 14.2, 17 satellites, 14 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 327, range 459, bearing 250, elevation 127, voltage 14.3, 16 satellites. 18 satellites. Heading 251, range 164, bearing 206, elevation 124, voltage 14.2, 6 minutes, 17 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 71, range 442, bearing 307, elevation 111, voltage 14.2, 17 satellites. 16 satellites. Heading 322, range 436, bearing 239, elevation 121, voltage 14.1, 16 satellites, 18 satellites. Heading 248, range 200, bearing 215, elevation 111, voltage 14.2, 18 satellites. 17 satellites. Heading 49, range 465, bearing 304, elevation 124, voltage 14.2, 18 satellites, 7 minutes. 17 satellites. Heading 340, range 449, bearing 245, elevation 124, voltage 14.1, 17 satellites. 18 satellites. Heading 184, range 196, bearing 228, elevation 121, voltage 14.1, 19 satellites, 16 satellites. Heading 47, range 449, bearing 297, elevation 111, voltage 14.1, 16 satellites. 15 satellites. Heading 340, range 465, bearing 237, elevation 134, voltage 14.1, 19 satellites. 8 minutes, 18 satellites. Heading 149, range 209, bearing 239, elevation 108, voltage 14.1, 18 satellites. 17 satellites, heading 29, range 479, bearing 295, elevation 124, Voltage 14.1, 20 satellites, 18 satellites. Heading 348, range 498, bearing 225, elevation 137. Voltage 14, 16 satellites. 20 satellites. Heading 129, range 206, bearing 243, elevation 131. Voltage 14.1, 18 satellites. 21 satellites, heading 40, range 469, bearing 290, elevation 91. Voltage 14, 9 minutes, 20 satellites. 19 satellites. Heading 282, range 429, bearing 227, elevation 141. Voltage 14.1, 21 satellites. 20 satellites. Heading 160, range 246, bearing 278, pilot has control angle, elevation 124. Voltage 14, 21 satellites. Heading 342, range 370, bearing 228, elevation 52. Voltage 14.2, 21 satellites. 20 satellites, heading 244, range 49, bearing 299, elevation